Well, here we are for the last little bit of these unemployment notes. Again, just the readings and the outline. What we're going to do now, we have defined these types of unemployment. We're going to put them together and define what we mean by full employment and introduce the concept of an output gap because this is both, well, this is definitely something that we're going to be turning to when we turn to the material, particularly in chapter 18 and beyond. So, so where are we? Well, we talked a while back in our overview of macro notes about a business cycle. So we said a business cycle is recurrent but not periodic, not uniform fluctuations in aggregate economic activity. And one way to describe a business cycle we kind of thought about then was as fluctuations of real gross domestic product around its long run trend growth rate. And so that's what we're showing over here in the graph on the right. But what we can also see now, because we talked about this in the context of cyclical unemployment, is that the business cycle involves the unemployment rate rising above its equilibrium level in a recession. So again, we said this notion of the equilibrium level, this is what we're going to come to again, is the idea that we're adding frictional and structural unemployment because we have those all the time. So a business cycle involves the unemployment rate rising above its equilibrium level, which is the sum of frictional and structural unemployment when we have a recession. So in other words, we are adding in the presence of cyclical unemployment. What I want to do right now, whoop whoop, is link these two ideas. How do we do that? Well, we do that by defining a concept that's known as potential real gross domestic product. And so notationally, the letter Y is what we were using for real gross domestic product. So I'm just putting a subscript of potential down below. So this is what we're going to define as full employment output. So full employment. We are going to say that we have full employment when we have no cyclical unemployment. So we'll see this on the next slide. So what is potential real gross domestic product? It is the level of real GDP that an economy can produce when its resources, particularly labor, but when it's measured, we're looking at all resources, are used at their normal or their equilibrium rates. And by equilibrium here, again, we mean this idea of a long run, so LR is long run equilibrium level, which again is structural plus frictional. In a market-based economy, we're always going to have these two types of unemployment. So normal means full employment or an equilibrium unemployment rate. So it is possible for the economy to produce more than its potential level of gross domestic product in a given, time period. So the potential level of gross domestic product is not, strictly speaking, the same thing as maximum output, but we think about situations in which the economy is producing more than its potential level as not being sustainable. So capital and labor, of course, can be utilized at greater than their normal rates. So we can have labor work extraordinary overtime hours, or same thing with physical capital. We can forego you taking it offline, taking, say, a machine offline and doing the normal maintenance and instead just running it a lot longer. But that's not, in a long run sense, going to be sustainable. So it is possible for the level of gross domestic product for a period of time to exceed that potential level, but not in perpetuity. So what do we think about when we're talking about full employment. So full employment, again, is how we are defining the equilibrium unemployment rate. So the equilibrium unemployment rate, again, is this idea in the long run that we have only frictional and structural unemployment. So synonymously with that, if only the level of unemployment that we observe can be attributed to frictional reasons and structural reasons, then by definition, there is no cyclical unemployment, or the cyclical unemployment level is zero. If you've taken macroeconomics before, you may have seen this referred to as the natural rate of unemployment. The authors in this textbook do not choose to adopt that language, but it's certainly something that you may see in other instances. And indeed, you're going to see this in a picture on the next slide. So what we then are saying is, if we observe an unemployment rate that is equal to how we are defining the equilibrium one. So this we observe, in other words, if we observe the one that we are defining as full employment, then we say that the economy is experiencing full employment, and in an associated manner, the level of gross domestic product that we observe is the potential level of gross domestic product. So again, I want to try to be as clear as I possibly can on this, and I feel like I've glossed over it. We define a certain level of unemployment as happening sort of normally in the macroeconomy. So it is not normal to have zero unemployment. There's going to be some frictional unemployment, some structural unemployment. Macroeconomists and statisticians form an estimate of what we would expect to see attributable to frictional and structural reasons, and we define that to be the equilibrium rate of unemployment. And then if we observe an unemployment rate that is higher than that, then we would say we have cyclical unemployment. And if we observe an unemployment rate that is below that or equal to that, then we would say that we have full employment. So for instance, here's a picture that I pulled down from Fred that shows estimates of, on Fred, it is the natural rate of unemployment. But again, that is synonymous with how the authors are thinking about the equilibrium rate of unemployment. If you open up this slideshow, I think in the notes page below this slide, you'll see that during the Great Recession, there was an estimate of natural rate of unemployment that was strictly attributable to the Great Recession, and that's this sort of uptick level that then returns to this common path. So for instance, the fourth quarter of 2020, the estimate of the equilibrium rate of unemployment, which is again unemployment that we would see if we had only frictional and structural, is 4.37%, with a forecast in 2024 of that dropping to around 4.25%. What do we observe today? Well, of course, we observe an unemployment rate today greater than 7%. So we observe say an unemployment rate of, I forget whether it's 7.2 or 7.3, but I'll call it 7.3 to get the rounding. And we think about full employment as being an unemployment rate, say, equal to 4.3%. What does this tell us? The inference here is that cyclical unemployment, so the unemployment that is due to the fact that we are currently in a recession, is 3%. So 3% plus so cyclical plus frictional and structural combined would give us the observed unemployment rate. And that's what I'm trying to summarize here. So if we observe an unemployment rate that we think of as being consistent with frictional and structural unemployment or the equilibrium unemployment level, then we are also saying that we have full employment so that our observed level of gross domestic product is the one that we would think of as being consistent with potential or full employment. So by actual here, again, what I mean is suppose we just go out and we observe an unemployment rate. Is it equal to, above, or below the one that we think of as being consistent with frictional plus structural unemployment? And again, if the observed unemployment rate is the one that we think of as being consistent with frictional and structural unemployment or full employment, then by definition, cyclical unemployment is zero. This would be an example of now. So, like in 2020, currently, we observe an actual unemployment rate, say, of 7.3%. The estimate for full employment would be we would have full employment with an unemployment rate of 4.3%. And so cyclical unemployment is positive, and we would say 3% of the people who are unemployed is attributable to cyclical unemployment. And we would also say that we have a negative output gap. So specifically, the observed level of gross domestic product is less than what we're capable of or what our potential level is. And sometimes this negative output gap is referred to as a recessionary GDP gap, but we're going to refer to our output gaps as just being positive or negative in this course. If we were to observe an actual unemployment rate that's less than the equilibrium one, so as recently as the end of 2019, by all accounts, this was the case. We had actual unemployment rates in the neighborhood of 3.8, 3.9%. The estimate of full employment was again around this 4.3%. Then we would say that we have an economy that is producing above its potential. We have more people employed than is consistent with full employment, and we are producing more output than is consistent with the potential level of gross domestic product, and we call that a positive output gap. So we are going to define an output gap as the difference between actual and potential gross domestic product expressed as a percentage of potential gross domestic product. So this would be, oops, there should be a minus sign in there. Sorry, I'll correct that. We've got it here. So this is, well, I don't have to write it because I have it here. Actual gross domestic product is what we're denoting with the Y. Potential gross domestic product is this one, and we express this difference as a fraction of potential gross domestic product, and we multiply by 100 to express this as a percentage, so to get an output gap in percentage terms. And so again, if it is the case that Y is bigger than the actual level of gross domestic product is bigger than potential, then we would have a positive output gap and vice versa. So to summarize then, a negative output gap is going to be one in which the actual level of output is below its potential. We think about this as being consistent with there being idle resources, consistent with high unemployment, and specifically cyclical unemployment that is positive. So here would be in the upper graph here, we have a depiction of the estimates of potential output, the dotted red line, and then the path of actual GDP is the blue. The gaps between the dotted red line and the blue actual gross domestic product are magnified down here to give us the measure of the output gap. So of course you can see, here we had in the late 1990s a situation which actual gross domestic product was bigger than potential, and we had a positive output gap, and similarly. And just prior to the onset of COVID, we were kind of entering into this positive output gap phase again. So a positive output gap means that actual GDP is bigger than potential GDP. The economy is using its resources more intensely than is consistent with full employment. And these periods, right? Oops. So that period right there, where actual and real GDP are actual GDP and potential GDP are the same, the output gap is 0, and we have full employment, and the observed unemployment rate, this U, is equal to the level of frictional plus structural unemployment. Full employment would be the same thing as saying cyclical unemployment is 0. So in the initial set of notes, we talked about the various costs of unemployment, and one of the costs that we identified as an economic cost is lost output. And so we turned to a way of estimating, just as a kind of back of the envelope calculation, how much output gets lost as a result of unemployment. And this is what we mean by Okun's rule of thumb. When I was an undergraduate, it was Okun's law. It has become somewhat less precise over the last maybe 15 to 20 years, and so the authors are referring to this as a rule of thumb, and that's really apropos. So what Okun's rule of thumb is saying is that the output gap is equal to negative 1/2 times the change in unemployment. So what this is saying, this is in words, is for every percentage point that the actual output falls below its potential, the unemployment rate is going to increase by around 1/2 percentage point. And that's, to me, still pretty confusing. So I have an example, and end of chapter problems work you through one. I'll probably, I don't know, figure out some other way to quiz you on it, perhaps. Here's an example. Suppose that initially the level of gross domestic product is the potential level. So we have full employment, and we'll suppose that full employment is when we have 5% unemployment. Then let's suppose that a recession emerges and the output gap becomes negative 4%. So what that means is that real GDP, Y, falls below potential gross domestic product by 4%. So this is 4 percentage points decline below potential real GDP. If we wanted to guess what the implications of that would be for unemployment, then we would guess that the unemployment rate would rise by 2 percentage points. So if initially we had an unemployment rate of 5%, then we'd predict that it would be 7%. So what this picture shows is actual real live US data, kind of depicting the line of best fit for Okun's rule of thumb. And so in my example, we had literally this. Oops, let's see if I can get my pen back. We had literally this going on. We said, suppose initially we have an output gap of 0%. We're at full employment, and that full employment is consistent with an unemployment rate of 5%. Then let's suppose that a recession happens and the output gap becomes more negative by 4 percentage points. Then what happens? We come up here, is that Okun's rule of thumb is telling us that the unemployment rate should rise by half that in terms of percentage points. And so that would be 2 percentage points from 5% unemployment to 7% unemployment. So that's how you interpret this. It's just a handy kind of, as the name suggests, rule of thumb for describing the relationship between changes in output and unemployment. And the reason that I introduce it especially is that occasionally you'll see somebody analyzing current events and they'll toss out some numbers and you might wonder, how did they get that relationship? And the relationship between unemployment and output gaps is the one that's being described by Okun's rule of thumb. So with that, we're going to conclude with our discussion of unemployment. And what we will do next is to turn to a discussion of consumption.